It is October 19th, 1781. The air over Yorktown, Virginia, hangs thick with a funereal silence, broken only by the rhythmic, solemn beat of a single drum. 2 miles of men, thousands upon thousands, stand in mute witness. On one side of the road, a Continental Army, ragged, weathered, and hardened by 6 brutal years of war, stands with a stillness that borders on disbelief. On the other side, their allies, the professional soldiers of the French king, immaculate in their white uniforms, looking every bit the global superpower they represent. Between these two lines, an army marches, but it does not march with the triumphant snap of a victor. Their flags are cased, their muskets are shouldered, muzzles down. Their music is slow, mournful. The tune they are ordered to play is a popular British song of the day, a song of irony, of absurdity, of things gone terribly wrong. The song is titled "A World Turned Upside Down." A British general, Charles O'Hara, second in command, rides at the head of the defeated column. His eyes dart around, looking for the commander of the French forces, the Comte de Rochambeau. He is searching for a fellow professional, a peer from an established power, to offer his sword. He cannot, will not surrender to the colonials, to the rebels. But Rochambeau, with a subtle gesture, points across the road. He points to him. George Washington, the American, Washington, seeing O'Hara, directs him to his own second, General Benjamin Lincoln. It was Lincoln who had been forced to surrender the American army at Charleston just a year earlier, a moment of profound national humiliation. Now it is Lincoln who will receive the sword of the British deputy. The world has, in every conceivable way, been turned upside down.
I say we march on Congress.
They'll hang you for that talk, Joe. Better than freezing to death here.
This is the end. This is the moment a global empire is humbled and a new nation is born from its blood and toil. But how did this happen? How did a bankrupt, exhausted, and mutinous colonial army, on the absolute brink of total collapse, managed to trap and destroy one of the finest armies the British Empire had ever fielded? They said it was impossible. The British had the greatest navy on earth. They had the wealth of an empire. They had professional, disciplined soldiers. The Americans had nothing. And yet, here they were. The victory at Yorktown was not an accident. It was not a fluke. It was the result of a perfectly executed plan, a plan that hinged on a logistical miracle, a brilliant campaign of deception, and at its very heart, a secret weapon. But it is not the weapon you think. It wasn't a new kind of rifle or a devastating cannon. It was something far larger, more complex, and more terrifying. It was a weapon that, when finally unleashed, made the British defeat not just possible, but a mathematical certainty. This is the story of how that weapon was forged, aimed, and fired. This is the story of the secret weapon that destroyed the British Redcoats. To understand the miracle of Yorktown, you must first understand the despair of 1781. The American Revolution was not in a good place. It was in its 6th year, and it was bleeding out. The initial patriotic fervor of 1776 was a distant, bitter memory. The Continental Army was a ghost of itself, rarely paid, perpetually hungry, and clothed in rags. In January of 1781, the entire Pennsylvania line of the Continental Army had mutinied, not deserted, mutinied. They seized cannons, killed 3 of their own officers, and marched on Congress in Philadelphia, demanding the back pay they were owed. One soldier, Joseph Plum Martin, a man who had been in the war from the beginning, wrote of the conditions that led to it. We were now, according to custom, about to pass through another winter. We had wintered at Valley Forge and saw enough of hardship there, but I think I saw more at this time. The old snake, I mean the monster, hunger, again visited us. We were again pinched with want. This was the army that was supposed to defeat the British Empire. George Washington, stationed in New York, could only watch, his correspondence filled with a quiet, desperate plea for money, for men, for anything. He was a man holding a crumbling edifice together with sheer, stubborn willpower. Meanwhile, The British had enacted their southern strategy. Believing the southern colonies were full of loyalists ready to flock back to the crown, they shifted the war. They had captured Savannah. They had crushed General Lincoln at Charleston, capturing over 5,000 American soldiers, the single worst defeat of the war. And now, their most aggressive, most capable, and most ruthless general was tearing through the South. Lord Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis was a predator. He had smashed an American army at the Battle of Camden and was now chasing the elusive American general Nathanael Greene across North Carolina. At the same time, the most hated man in America, the traitor Benedict Arnold, now a British brigadier general, was leading raids in Washington's home state of Virginia, burning Richmond to the ground. The British strategy was working. They were cutting the colonies in half. The South was falling. New York was a fortress. The American economy had collapsed. The Continental, the paper money issued by Congress, was literally worthless. The phrase "not worth a Continental" became a common saying. The French, America's only true ally, were also losing patience. They had sent an army of 5,500 men under the Comte de Rochambeau, a seasoned, skeptical, and brilliant professional soldier. But Rochambeau's army had been sitting in Newport, Rhode Island, for a year, blockaded by the British fleet, doing nothing. The French had gambled on this alliance, and it looked like they had bet on a losing horse. Rochambeau wrote to his government in March 1781, a blunt assessment: "Send you us troops, ships, and money, but above all, money. The time is fast approaching when, if we do not have it, the whole structure will collapse, and this revolution will be at an end." This was the backdrop. Not a story of rising triumph, but of impending doom. The American experiment was on life support. Washington knew he needed one decisive victory. He needed to land a knockout blow, or the war was over. His eyes, as always, were fixed on the great British stronghold of New York City, held by General Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief. Washington dreamed of attacking it, of liberating it in a grand climactic battle. But Rochambeau, the French professional, knew better. Attacking a fortified city held by 14,000 British regulars and shielded by the Royal Navy was not a battle, it was suicide. The Allies were at an impasse, their cause crumbling. But across the Atlantic, a decision was being made, and in the Caribbean, a fleet was preparing to sail. The secret weapon was beginning to move. The weapon had a name: François-Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse, Admiral de Grasse. He was the commander of the French fleet in the West Indies, and in the spring of 1781, he received his orders. He was to sail his fleet north to the American coast, to cooperate with Washington and Rochambeau in a campaign. But he had a condition. He could only stay for a few months. The winds of the Caribbean were fickle, and hurricane season was approaching. He would arrive in late August and must leave by mid-October. This was the window. A tiny, desperate window of opportunity. Washington and Rochambeau met in Wethersfield, Connecticut, in May 1781 to decide the fate of the revolution. Washington, stubborn, still pushed for New York. But the message from de Grasse changed everything. He was sailing not to New York, but to the Chesapeake Bay. This was the moment of decision. At the same time, Lord Cornwallis, after a bloody and fruitless campaign in the Carolinas, made a fateful and ultimately fatal decision. Disobeying direct orders from his superior, General Clinton, who wanted him to protect the British holdings in the Carolinas, Cornwallis marched his army north into Virginia. He believed that to conquer the South, he must first cut off its head in Virginia. He chased a small American force led by a 23-year-old French aristocrat, the energetic and loyal Marquis de Lafayette. After months of campaigning, Cornwallis was ordered by Clinton to establish a fortified naval base, a place where the Royal Navy could dock, resupply, and dominate the Chesapeake. He chose a small, deep-water tobacco port, a place called Yorktown. He arrived in early August, and his 8,000 men began to dig. He was building a fortress, but what he was really digging was a grave. He was confident, almost arrogant. And why shouldn't he be? He was Lord Cornwallis, and the Royal Navy, the masters of the ocean, would protect his back. It was an assumption that had held true for the entire war. It was an assumption that was about to cost him everything. When Washington and Rochambeau learned that de Grasse was sailing for the Chesapeake, and that Cornwallis was digging in at Yorktown, the pieces of the puzzle, scattered for 6 long years, suddenly clicked. This was the plan. A plan of breathtaking audacity, complexity, and risk. They would not attack New York. They would abandon New York. They would secretly march both the French and American armies, over 7,000 men, 450 miles south to Virginia. There, they would link up with Lafayette's small force, and, if de Grasse arrived, if he could control the sea, they would trap Cornwallis. This plan was insane. The logistics were a nightmare. An army of that size needed tons of food, supplies, and forage every single day. The roads were terrible, and above all, it had to be done in total secrecy. If General Clinton in New York, with his massive 14,000-man army, realized what was happening, he could sally out and destroy them on the march. Or even worse, he could send the British fleet to intercept de Grasse, or put his entire army on ships and race them south to reinforce Cornwallis. The deception that followed was one of the most brilliant in military history. Washington became a master of misinformation. He wrote fake letters to generals describing his detailed plans for an attack on New York, and let them fall into British hands. He ordered huge encampments and boat-building operations to be set up in New Jersey, all within sight of the British lookouts in Manhattan. He had his men build massive bread ovens, enough to feed an army of 20,000, as if preparing for a long siege. One American soldier, Jonathan Blanchard, wrote, "To all appearances, we were to attack New York. This was so strongly impressed on the minds of all that no one, I believe, calculated on any other movement. We were all looking for a severe and bloody siege." General Clinton took the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. He was so convinced New York was the target that he even wrote to Cornwallis, promising reinforcements, but also asking Cornwallis to send him troops from Virginia to help defend New York. He was completely, utterly blind. On August 19, 1781, the Allied armies began to move. They first marched north, as if to find a crossing above New York, further selling the lie. Then they turned. They crossed the Hudson, and under the screen of a small force left behind to continue the deception, the main army began to march south. And fast. They marched through New Jersey, through Pennsylvania. When they reached Philadelphia, the French soldiers, with their immaculate uniforms and shining silver, were a revelation. But the Americans were a different story. One French officer, the Comte de Clermont-Crèvecoeur, observed them with a mix of pity and awe. "I have never seen a regiment in so bad a state. The men were not clothed, but naked. They were without trousers, shirts, or shoes. I was heartbroken. But to see these brave fellows almost naked, with such a good face, and bearing their hardships so gaily, made me admire them." But there was a problem. The Americans, unpaid, refused to march past Philadelphia. They were on the verge of another mutiny. The entire plan, the entire revolution, was about to fall apart over empty pockets. Washington was desperate. Rochambeau, seeing the crisis, stepped in. He gave Washington half of his entire war chest, $20,000 in hard silver. The Americans were paid. The march continued. Still, the entire time, Washington was consumed by a gnawing, terrible anxiety. He was marching an army 450 miles, based on a single promise. He had not heard from Admiral de Grasse in weeks. Had he sailed? Was he delayed? Was he intercepted? If de Grasse did not show up, Washington and Rochambeau would be stranded in Virginia with no navy, no supplies, and 2 British armies, Cornwallis's and Clinton's, ready to crush them. It was the greatest gamble of his life. On September 5, 1781, the same day Washington and Rochambeau were parading through Philadelphia, a French lookout on the frigate Aigrette spotted a forest of masts on the horizon. They were off the coast of Virginia, at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Admiral de Grasse and his 28 ships of the line had arrived. He had landed 3,000 French infantry to reinforce Lafayette. The first part of the trap was set, but just as his ships were anchoring, the lookouts called again. Another fleet, this time approaching from the north. It was the British. Admiral Thomas Graves, with 19 ships of the line, had arrived from New York. He had finally figured out, or guessed, where de Grasse was. What happened next was not just a naval battle. It was the single most important and decisive engagement of the entire American Revolution. It was the Battle of the Chesapeake, and it was a disaster for the British. The two fleets were colossal. These were the largest, most complex, and most expensive weapons on Earth. A single ship of the line was a floating fortress, carrying over 70 guns and 700 men. The battle itself was a complex, almost balletic, affair of wind, signal flags, and thunderous broadsides. The British were at a disadvantage. They had fewer ships, and they were sailing into the bay, against the wind, while the French were sailing out. But the real British failure was one of command. Admiral Graves was a good, by-the-book admiral, but his signals were confusing. His lead ships under Admiral Hood either misunderstood or disagreed with the orders. The British line became disorganized, tacked, and only the front half of their fleet ever truly engaged the French. De Grasse, by contrast, held his line perfectly. For over 2 hours, the two fleets sailed alongside each other, blasting away. A sailor on a British ship described the scene: the noise and din of battle, the firing of cannon, the smoke, the cries of the wounded, and the shouts of the combatants formed a scene of horror which it is not in my power to describe. But the French, with more guns and a more disciplined formation, mauled the British vans. The ship Terrible was so aptly named and so badly damaged, it had to be scuttled, burned, and sunk by the British themselves. Several other ships were shattered. After a few days of maneuvering, with his fleet damaged and his command in chaos, Admiral Graves made the stunning decision. He turned his fleet around. He sailed back to New York to repair, and he hoped to return with more ships. He had just sealed Cornwallis's fate. The secret weapon, French sea power, had done its job. The door was slammed shut. The key was turned in the lock. There would be no reinforcement. There would be no resupply. And for Lord Cornwallis, there would be no escape. A few days later, Washington and Rochambeau, having ridden ahead of their armies, arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia. They were met by Lafayette. The tension was unbearable. As they ate, a rider arrived, soaked in sweat, carrying a dispatch. It was from de Grasse. He had engaged the British. He had defeated the British. He was in complete control of the Chesapeake Bay. Washington's reaction was, for a man famous for his iron self-control, utterly out of character. He ran out of the dining room, waving the dispatch. He saw the Comte de Rochambeau, and in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, he waved his arms, shouting. Some say he even tried to hug the Frenchman. One of his aides, St. George Tucker, wrote, "I had never seen him so delighted." He knew. At that moment, he knew he had him. By September 26th, the Allied armies, over 17,000 men in total, Americans, French regulars, and the new troops from de Grasse's fleet, had arrived. They formed a semicircle around Yorktown. Cornwallis and his 8,000 British Hessian and Loyalist troops were now officially, hopelessly surrounded. But Cornwallis was a bulldog. He was not going to surrender. He believed Clinton would send a relief force. His men were professionals, and they had built strong fortifications. He had 10 redoubts, earthen forts, protecting his main line. He just had to hold on. He made, however, another critical error. His outer defenses, 3 redoubts, he deemed too exposed. On the night of September 29th, he ordered his men to abandon them and pull back to his main line. It was a terrible mistake. The Allies, stunned, simply walked in the next day and occupied them. These abandoned forts would become the starting point for the entire Allied siege. Now, the other secret weapon began its work. The French were not just soldiers, they were the undisputed masters of siege warfare, a brutal scientific and mathematical form of destruction. Rochambeau had brought with him some of the finest military engineers in the world, and they had brought the big guns. The Americans had been fighting the war with small 6-pounder field guns. The French unloaded 24-pounders, 18-pounders, massive mortars, and howitzers. In total, the Allies would amass over 170 pieces of heavy artillery. The British, by contrast, had only about 70. The siege began. But it was not a mad rush. It was a cold, calculated engineering problem. On the night of October 6th, in the dark and the rain, thousands of Allied soldiers began to dig. They were digging a parallel, a massive trench 2 miles long that would shield them from British cannon fire. It was back-breaking work. Men dug with shovels while others stood guard, musket in hand. They moved in silence. One American private, Joseph Plum Martin, was there. We were digging. We had to proceed with caution. We were, I believe, in a more hazardous situation than I had ever been in before. We were so near the enemy that we could hear their sentinels. All's well. Within a few days, the first siege parallel was complete. It was about 800 yards from the British lines. The heavy guns were rolled in, dragged by hundreds of men through mud, and placed in new, heavily fortified batteries. On October 9th, at 3 p.m., the Allied bombardment began. The first shot was fired symbolically by George Washington himself. The French grand battery of 10 cannons and 6 mortars opened up, then another battery, and another. Soon, over 50 guns were firing in rotation, 24 hours a day. The effect was not just destructive, it was apocalyptic. This was not a battle, it was an execution. A French soldier, the Chevalier, inside Yorktown, it was hell on earth. Cannonballs, weighing 24 pounds, smashed through the wooden houses, shattering them into splinters. Mortar shells, bombs with long, burning fuses, arched high into the air and exploded inside the fortifications, sending shrapnel in every direction. A British surgeon stuck inside the town wrote, "I have this day been a witness to a scene of misery, which I shall never forget. I saw men lying with their skulls beaten, and their bodies mangled by the bursting of bombs." Governor Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia, who was with Washington, had his own house in Yorktown, which he believed was being used as Cornwallis's headquarters. He famously told Washington to fire on it. He urged them to fire upon his own house. And he had the satisfaction of seeing it, in a short time, in a state of ruin. But there was another, even more insidious enemy inside Yorktown. This was the other secret weapon: disease. The 8,000 British troops were now packed into a space of less than 1 square mile. Their sanitation was non-existent. Their water supply from wells became contaminated, and it was October in Virginia, the mosquito season. Malaria was rampant, dysentery, typhoid, and worst of all, smallpox, tore through the British camp. Cornwallis's army began to rot from the inside. This was especially true for the black loyalists. Thousands of enslaved people had fled their American masters, drawn by British promises of freedom. They had flocked to Cornwallis's army, but now, cooped up in Yorktown with no food and no sanitation, they were the first to die. Smallpox ravaged their camps. In a move of shocking brutality, Cornwallis, seeing them as only a drain on his dwindling food supplies, ordered over 1,000 of them to be expelled from the town. They were pushed out into the no-man's land between the two armies. There, they lay dying, starving, and sick. One American witness, Colonel John Lighthorse Harry Lee, father of Robert E. Lee, described the scene. They were turned to starvation. The enemy, committing them to the Lord, drove them into the face of the American sentinels. It was not uncommon to see hundreds of these lying dead in the woods. Cornwallis's effective fighting force was shrinking by the day. He had over 8,000 men on paper, but by the second week of the siege, perhaps only 5,000 were healthy enough to stand on the parapets. The first parallel was a stunning success, but it was not enough. The range, 800 yards, was still too great to completely destroy the British fortifications. The Allies needed to get closer. They needed a second parallel. On the night of October 11th, the engineers crept forward and began to lay out a new trench, this one only 400 yards from the British line. But there was a problem. Two British fortifications, two small but critical redoubts, stood in the way. Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10. They were advanced, strong, and manned by veteran British and Hessian troops. They were studded with sharpened wooden stakes called abatis. They could not be bypassed. They could not be destroyed by cannon fire. They had to be taken by hand, by storm, at night with the bayonet. This was the climax, the single bloodiest, most dramatic, and most personal moment of the siege. The plan was for a two-pronged, simultaneous night attack on October 14th. The French, as the senior professional force, would take the larger fortification, Redoubt 9. The Americans, to foster a sense of Allied pride and frankly to prove they could do it, would take Redoubt 10. Command of the American assault was a coveted prize. The Marquis de Lafayette was in overall command, and he chose his own former aide to lead the 400-man assault force, a young, ambitious, and frustrated lieutenant colonel who was desperate for glory. His name was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton wrote his plan with his typical meticulous fervor. The attack would be made with unloaded muskets. This was not for silence. This was to ensure there was no panic, no disorganized firefight in the dark. This was to be cold steel, bayonets only. As night fell on October 14th, the Allied batteries, which had been firing for 5 straight days, suddenly went silent. The silence was perhaps more terrifying than the noise. In the darkness, the 400 Americans under Hamilton and 400 French under Colonel de Dupont crept out of their trenches. They moved through the shell-cratered landscape. At 8 p.m., a single shell was fired into the air. It was the signal. Hamilton's men charged. They ran through the darkness, American sappers, engineers in front, hacking at the wooden abatis with axes. The British, stunned, opened fire. The work was bloody, one American soldier said. Hamilton, not a large man, was the first to reach the parapet. He scrambled up, stood for a moment, and yelled, "Huzzah! The fort is ours!" His men flooded in. The fighting inside was brutal, short, and personal. It was a chaotic mess of bayonets, musket butts, and shouting in the dark. But the Americans had the element of surprise in overwhelming numbers. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. Redoubt 10 was theirs. The French assault on Redoubt 9 was, characteristically, more professional, more orderly, and bloodier. The Hessians and British inside were more prepared. They put up a fierce resistance. The French, methodical, advanced, cut their way through the defenses, and engaged in a longer, more drawn-out firefight and bayonet charge. It took them over half an hour, and they suffered nearly 100 casualties. But they too took their objective. A young French officer, the Comte de Vauban, wrote, "The moment was terrible for the enemy. The fear of the bayonet made them cry for mercy. This was granted to them, despite the fact that a moment before, they had been killing us. The effect was immediate. The capture of Redoubts 9 and 10 was the death blow. The Allies now had an anchor for their second parallel. Within hours, thousands of men were in the captured forts, digging, connecting them to the new trench line, and the heavy guns began to move forward. By October 16th, the second parallel was complete. The Allied artillery was now just 400 yards from the main British line. It was point-blank range for siege cannons. Section 12, Final Bombardment. 404 words. The bombardment that followed was unlivable. It was no longer a siege, it was a demolition. The Allied guns were now firing down into the British positions. They were so close, they were using hot-shot cannonballs, heated red-hot in a furnace that set the remaining British buildings, and even their last remaining frigate, the Charon, on fire. A Hessian soldier named Johann Dohle wrote in his diary what it was like, October 17th. The bombardment is horrible. One can no longer rest in any place. One is afraid to be in his tent. The shells fly over the whole town. Many men have been badly wounded or killed. We are lost. Cornwallis was now in a bunker, his headquarters a cave dug into the side of a bluff. He knew it was over, but he had two last desperate gambles. First, on the night of the 16th, he ordered a sortie, a counterattack. A few hundred British soldiers, in a brave but futile gesture, stormed out of their lines and attacked the Allied batteries, managing to spike a few of the cannons, jamming a nail into their touch holes. It was a pinprick. The guns were repaired and firing again within 6 hours. The second gamble was an escape. On the same night, Cornwallis decided to try and evacuate his entire army. He would leave his sick and wounded behind, cross the York River in a fleet of small boats to Gloucester Point, and then try to fight his way north to New York. The first wave of troops, the elite guards, actually made it across. But then, as the boats were returning for the second wave, the weather, which had been clear, suddenly turned. A violent storm, a classic nor'easter, blew in. The wind and rain scattered his boats. The river became an impassable, raging torrent. It was the final nail. It was as if the heavens themselves had declared for the American cause. The next morning, October 17th, 1781, 4 years, to the very day after the great American victory at Saratoga, the guns of the Allied line fell silent. They had noticed something. At 10 a.m., a single small figure appeared on the shattered British parapet. It was a British drummer boy beating his drum. Not for a charge, not for an alarm. He was beating the parley. Section 13, the white flag, 419 words. Then a British officer appeared, waving a white handkerchief tied to a stick. Joseph Plum Martin described the moment. We heard, "Cease firing." On looking, we saw a drum and a man with a white flag. The drum beat and the flag was waved. A hush, he said, fell over the entire army. A complete, profound silence. They had won. The officer was blindfolded and led through the Allied lines to a small farmhouse, the Moore House. Negotiations began. Washington's terms were simple, brutal, and non-negotiable. He would grant Cornwallis the same terms the British had granted General Lincoln at Charleston, an unconditional surrender. The British army would become prisoners of war. Cornwallis had to accept. He had no food, no ammunition, no healthy men, and no hope. And so, 2 days later, on October 19th, the surrender ceremony was held. The British and Hessians marched out of their destroyed town, the French immaculate on the right, the Americans ragged on the left. The British Adjutant General had ordered the bands to play a slow march. They chose the world turned upside down. When General O'Hara, substituting for the ill Cornwallis, tried to surrender to Rochambeau, the French professional, Rochambeau simply shook his head and pointed. He pointed to Washington, and Washington, in a final, brilliant act of symbolic justice, pointed to Benjamin Lincoln. The man who had been humiliated at Charleston was now the man who would accept the surrender. The world indeed was righted. Thousands of muskets were thrown to the ground. The British soldiers, many of them, wept with rage and humiliation. It was over. When the news reached London, the Prime Minister, Lord North, who had prosecuted the war for all 6 years, received the dispatch. He opened it, and, as his colleague described, he took it as he would have taken a ball in the breast. He opened his arms, exclaiming wildly, "Oh God, it is all over!" He was right. The war would technically drag on for 2 more years. But this was the end. Yorktown broke the will of the British Parliament. It shattered the belief that the war could be won. It was the victory that secured American independence. So what, then, was the secret weapon? It was not one thing. It was a perfect, terrible convergence. It was the intelligence, the brilliant deception that fooled General Clinton and allowed an army to move 450 miles in secret. It was the logistics, the miracle of the march, the French money that paid the soldiers, the sheer will to move thousands of men and tons of equipment. It was the disease, the silent, invisible killer that hollowed out the British army from within, turning their fortress into a plague pit. It was the engineering, the cold, mathematical and overwhelming science of the French siege, and the devastating, unceasing power of their heavy guns. But the keystone, the one single piece that held the entire, complex, impossible plan together, the piece without which it all would have failed, was the fleet. The true secret weapon was Admiral de Grasse, 28 ships of the line. It was French sea power. It was the French Navy that slammed the door, locked the trap, and turned a British fortress into a British prison. It was the French Navy that proved that this was no longer a colonial rebellion. It was a global war. And Britain, for the first time, was fighting an enemy it could not defeat. The American Revolution was won not just by Minutemen with squirrel rifles. It was won by a complex, international, and profoundly modern combination of arms. It was won by sea power, by artillery, by logistics, and by an alliance. It was won at Yorktown, where all of these forces came together to turn the world upside down.